A woman married a respectable merchant in 1788. 3 years later, she discovered her husband was having an affair. But not with just anyone. With her own sister, in her own home, under her own roof. And when she tried to leave him, the law told her she didn't exist. She had no rights, no voice, no escape. But Elizabeth Hartford refused to accept that answer. What she did next would shock the entire nation and change the course of history forever. This is her story. London, 1788. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Clement's Church as Elizabeth Margaret Hartford walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk. At 21, she was the picture of grace. Educated, well-spoken, and from a family that moved in respectable circles. Her father, Sir Richard Hartford, was a member of Parliament, a man who understood power and how to wield it. He had ensured Elizabeth received an education far beyond what most young women could dream of. She could read Latin, discuss philosophy, and navigate a dinner party with the kind of wit that made men both nervous and intrigued. And now she was marrying Thomas Ashford, a successful merchant with a townhouse in Westminster and a country estate in Sussex. "Do you, Elizabeth, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the vicar asked. Elizabeth glanced at Thomas, his dark hair perfectly combed, his expression confident, his smile seemingly genuine. "I do," she whispered. What Elizabeth didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the moment those words left her lips, she legally ceased to exist. As they walked out of the church into the cheering crowd, Thomas leaned close to her ear. "You're mine now, Elizabeth, completely mine." She laughed, thinking it was romantic. She had no idea how literal he meant it. The first few months were blissful. Thomas was attentive, charming, and generous. He bought Elizabeth beautiful gowns, took her to the theater, and introduced her to London's elite society. But slowly, things began to shift. One afternoon, Elizabeth sat in the drawing room of their Westminster townhouse, reviewing the household accounts. She frowned at several entries. "Thomas," she called as he entered, "there's an error in the ledger. The payment to the draper is listed twice." Thomas barely glanced at the book. "That's not your concern, darling." "But it's clearly a mistake. We've overpaid by Elizabeth." His voice was sharp now. "You don't need to trouble yourself with such matters. That's my responsibility." She blinked, confused. "I'm only trying to help. I managed my father's accounts before we married." Thomas walked over and gently, but firmly, closed the ledger. "Things are different now. You're my wife. The household finances are my domain. Your job is to be charming at dinner parties and ensure the servants don't steal the silver." Elizabeth felt a strange tightness in her chest, but said nothing. A week later, she received a letter from her aunt in Bath, requesting a small loan to help with medical expenses. Elizabeth immediately sat down to write a bank draft from her dowry account. When Thomas found her at the writing desk, his face darkened. "What are you doing?" "I'm writing to my aunt. She needs help with—" She snatched the paper from her hand. "Your dowry is now my property, Elizabeth. You don't have the authority to dispense funds." "My property?" She stood, indignant. "That money came from my family, and you gave it to me when you married me. That's the law. You own nothing. Not your dowry, not your jewelry, not even the clothes on your back. It all belongs to me." Elizabeth stared at him, the reality of her situation finally beginning to dawn on her. "You can't be serious." Thomas's expression softened slightly, but his words remained firm. "I'm not being cruel, Elizabeth. This is simply how marriage works. You're under my protection now. I make the decisions." That night, Elizabeth lay awake beside her sleeping husband, feeling like a stranger in her own life. She thought about her mother, who had always seemed quietly resigned, her grandmother, who spoke little and smiled less, The married women she knew, who all had the same distant look in their eyes. She finally understood why. In the spring of 1791, Elizabeth's world shifted again, but this time in a way she could never have predicted. Her older sister Catherine arrived from India. Catherine had married Dr. William Ashford, no relation to Thomas despite the surname, 5 years earlier, and he'd taken a position in Calcutta. Catherine had thrived there, the exotic location, the adventure, the distance from England's suffocating social rules. But now she was back, claiming she needed a respite from the heat. "Lizzie!" Catherine swept into the townhouse in a flurry of silk and perfume, embracing her younger sister. "Look at you! Marriage suits you! You look positively radiant!" Elizabeth forced a smile. "Catherine, it's wonderful to see you. How long will you be staying?" "Oh, a few months at least. William is buried in his work, and I was growing dreadfully bored." She glanced around the elegant drawing room. "Your husband has done well for himself, hasn't he?" Thomas entered at that moment, and she made the introductions. "Thomas, this is my sister Catherine. Catherine, my husband, Thomas Ashford." Thomas took Catherine's hand, holding it just a moment too long. "Mrs. Ashford, what a pleasure! Elizabeth has told me so much about you." Catherine's smile was dazzling. "All good things, I hope." "Naturally." His eyes lingered on her in a way that made Elizabeth's stomach turn, though she couldn't quite say why. Catherine stayed for dinner, and then she stayed for a week, and then, somehow, she was still there a month later. "Doesn't Catherine need to return to William?" Elizabeth asked Thomas one evening. "She's family," Thomas said dismissively. "We can hardly turn her out. Besides, she's delightful company." Delightful. That was certainly one word for it. Elizabeth began noticing things. The way Thomas laughed at Catherine's jokes, loud, genuine laughs he never gave Elizabeth anymore. The way he insisted Catherine sit beside him at dinner. The way he'd brush past Elizabeth in the hallway, but would stop to have long conversations with Catherine about nothing in particular. She was going mad. She had to be. Her own sister, her own husband. It was unthinkable. But that night, laying in bed, Elizabeth heard it. A soft creak in the hallway. Footsteps. She sat up slowly, her heart pounding. Through the crack in the door, she saw a figure moving past. Thomas, in his nightshirt, carrying a candle. He walked past her room without glancing in, and continued down the hall. Toward Catherine's room. Her breath caught. She waited, frozen, listening. 5 minutes passed, 10, 20. Finally, she couldn't bear it. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold floor, and crept down the hallway. Catherine's door was closed, but a sliver of light showed underneath. She pressed her ear to the door. Low voices. A woman's laugh. Catherine's laugh. Then silence. Then sounds that made Elizabeth's stomach stave. She stumbled back to her room, tears streaming down her face, and pressed her fist against her mouth to keep from screaming. Her husband, her sister, in her own home. Elizabeth said nothing. What could she say? Who would believe her? And even if they did, what could she do about it? But the servants knew. Oh, the servants always knew. Martha, the housemaid, had come to call Thomas the ghost. She told the other servants about it one afternoon while Elizabeth eavesdropped from around the corner. "I swear on my mother's grave," she whispered dramatically to the cook. "I saw him last night creeping down the hall like a phantom. Thought I was seeing spirits, I did, but then I realized it was the master in his nightclothes, heading straight for Mrs. Catherine's room." The cook clucked her tongue. "That's wicked, that is. Right under the mistress's nose. And you know what's worse?" Martha leaned in conspiratorially. "I stayed up the next night just to see if I was imagining things. And there he was again. midnight, off he goes. Didn't come back for near an hour. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she held her teacup. So she hadn't imagined it. It was real. They all knew. She decided to confront Catherine first. "We need to talk," Elizabeth said one morning, finding her sister in the morning room. "Of course, darling. What about?" "About you and Thomas." Catherine's needle paused for just a fraction of a second. "About us?" "I know what's happening. I've seen the way you look at each other. I've heard—" Elizabeth's voice broke. "How could you? You're my sister, my own sister!" Catherine set down her embroidery with exaggerated calm.
"Elizabeth, I don't know what you think you've seen, but you're being hysterical." "Hysterical?" Elizabeth's voice rose. "I heard you, both of you, in your room." "You heard nothing," Catherine said coldly. "And even if you had, what exactly do you plan to do about it? Tell father? Tell the authorities? Don't be stupid, Lizzie. You have no proof. And even if you did, who would care? You're a wife. You have no rights, no voice, no recourse." The words hit Elizabeth like a slap. Catherine stood, smoothing her skirts. "Thomas is bored with you. You're dull. You always have been. All your books and your cleverness, what good has it done you? You couldn't even keep your own husband interested." Elizabeth felt tears burning her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Get out." "What?" "Get out of my house, now." Catherine laughed, actually laughed. "Your house? Oh, Lizzie, you don't even own a dress you're wearing. This is Thomas's house, and if he wants me here, I'll stay." She swept out of the room, leaving Elizabeth standing alone, shaking with rage and humiliation. That night, Elizabeth confronted Thomas. "I want Catherine gone," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Thomas didn't even look up from his newspaper. "No. Thomas, I know what's happening between you two." "Do you? And what exactly do you think you know?" "I know you're betraying me, with my own sister, in my own home." Thomas folded his newspaper slowly. "First of all, this is my home. Second, even if what you're suggesting were true, which I neither confirm nor deny, what would you do about it? Divorce me?" He laughed bitterly. "Women don't divorce their husbands, Elizabeth. It's impossible. You're stuck with me until death do us part." "The law?" "The law?" He stood now, towering over her. "The law says you're my property. The law says I can do whatever I please. If I wanted to throw you out on the street tomorrow, I could. You'd have nothing. No money, no home, no children. Yes, they'd be mine too. So I suggest you accept the situation and stop making a fool of yourself." Elizabeth felt the walls closing in. He was right. The law was on his side. Society was on his side. Even her own sister had turned against her. But then Thomas made a mistake. He underestimated just how far Elizabeth was willing to go. 6 months later, Catherine's husband, Dr. William Ashford, returned to England unexpectedly. He'd received an anonymous letter, possibly from a disgruntled servant, detailing his wife's affair. He was not pleased. William was a proud man, a physician of some renown, and the humiliation of being cuckolded by his own brother-in-law, by marriage, though no blood relation, was too much to bear. He did what men were allowed to do. He sued Thomas Ashford for criminal conversation, essentially adultery with his wife. The trial was a sensation. All of London's society turned out to watch. Servants testified. Letters were read aloud. The evidence was damning. Elizabeth sat in the gallery watching her entire life become public entertainment. Part of her felt vindicated. Finally, people knew the truth. But another part felt sick. This wasn't justice. This was spectacle. The jury awarded William £5,000 in damages, an astronomical sum. But here's what enraged Elizabeth. William was compensated for his property being damaged. Catherine was his property. Thomas had trespassed on another man's property. No one asked Elizabeth what she'd lost. No one compensated her for the betrayal, the humiliation, the years of gaslighting, because legally, she didn't exist. That night, Elizabeth sat in her father's study, her mind racing. "Father," she said quietly, "I want a divorce." "Elizabeth, my dear, I know what you're going to say, that it's impossible, that no woman has ever done it. But Father, you sit in Parliament, you know the law, there must be a way." Her father sighed deeply. "There is a way, but it's never been done. Parliament would have to pass a private act dissolving your marriage. The cost alone. How much? Thousands of pounds, and even then they might refuse. They always refuse women." Elizabeth looked at her father, her jaw set with determination. "If you're truly willing to fight this," he said slowly, "I'll help you. But Elizabeth, you need to understand, this will destroy you socially. You'll be scandalous. No one will receive you." "I'm already destroyed," Elizabeth said simply. "At least this way I'll be free." The petition to Parliament was filed in early 1801. Elizabeth Hartford was asking for the impossible, a divorce granted to a woman. The legal community was in an uproar. The newspapers called her everything from bold to shameless. Society matrons whispered that she was setting a dangerous precedent. Some men worried openly that if Elizabeth succeeded, their own wives might get ideas. The evidence was presented to the House of Lords. Servants testified about the ghost who wandered the halls. Letters between Thomas and Catherine were read aloud, their intimate contents causing gasps in the chamber. The details of the affair were laid bare. But the key argument Elizabeth's lawyers made was this: Thomas hadn't just committed adultery. He'd committed adultery with Elizabeth's sister, an act so close to incest that it violated even the most basic moral standards. Under church law, marriage between a man and his wife's sister was forbidden. This wasn't just betrayal, it was depraved. Lord Haverford, an elderly peer with 7 daughters of his own, stood to speak. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice trembling with emotion, "we have created a system in which we can punish a man who steals a horse, but we cannot help a woman whose husband steals her dignity, her home, and her very sister. We can imprison a man who damages another man's property, but we tell a wife to endure in silence when she is the one damaged." He paused, looking around the chamber. "Mrs. Hartford is asking us for mercy, for justice, and gentlemen, if we do not grant it, then what are we? What is our law worth if it protects no one but ourselves?" The debate raged for hours. Some lords argued that granting Elizabeth a divorce would open the floodgates. Others insisted her case was so exceptional that it could never be a precedent. Finally, a vote was called. The chamber fell silent as the votes were counted. And then the announcement. The petition is granted. Elizabeth Hartford became the first woman in England to successfully divorce her husband by Act of Parliament. Elizabeth's freedom came with a price. Society shunned her. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Invitations stopped arriving. She was whispered about in parlors across London. But Elizabeth discovered something remarkable. She didn't care. For the first time in her life, she owned herself. She could sign contracts, control her own money, make her own decisions. She was no longer erased by marriage. She moved to a small cottage in the countryside, taking her 2 children with her, another unprecedented victory. Parliament had deemed Thomas so morally unfit that they'd granted Elizabeth custody. One afternoon, about a year after her divorce, Elizabeth received a letter. It was from Thomas, who had fled to France to avoid paying the damages to William. The letter was rambling, pathetic, blaming everyone but himself. Elizabeth read it once, then walked to the fireplace and threw it into the flames. She watched it burn, feeling nothing but relief. But the most unexpected letter came from another woman, and then another, and then another. Women from across England wrote to Elizabeth, telling her their own stories of abuse, betrayal, and entrapment.
They thanked her for showing them it was possible to fight back. Elizabeth kept every letter, and she began responding, offering what advice she could. She couldn't save them all. The law was still stacked against women, but she could offer hope. In 1802, Elizabeth remarried a kind widower named Jonathan Pierce, who treated her as an equal. They lived quietly but happily for many years. Before she died in 1851, at the age of 84, Elizabeth lived long enough to see the beginning of change. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 made divorce accessible through courts instead of Parliament. It wasn't perfect. Men still had far more rights than women, but it was progress. And it started with one woman who refused to accept that the law made her invisible.
Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through Elizabeth Hartford's story, a tale of betrayal, courage, and the fight for justice against impossible odds. While Elizabeth's story is a dramatized retelling, it was inspired by the real struggles of women in 19th-century England, women who dared to challenge the laws that silenced them and paved the way for the rights many enjoy today. Her story reminds us that the freedoms we have now were won by those who refused to accept the world as it was. If this story moved you or made you think differently about the battles women have fought, give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to iMoney Quest for more powerful stories about love, law, and the human spirit. And hit the bell so you never miss an episode that will make you laugh, ponder, and question the world around you.